Hello and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. Maybe I should have qualified that. It also takes a look at newfangled ideas in the macroeconomic space, and that's what we're going to do in this particular episode. We're going to take a dispassionate look at universal basic income, an idea that seems to have united both the extreme left and the extreme right, and that to my mind immediately makes it suspect. To get back to the subject, a full chapter in this year's economic survey was devoted to discussing universal basic income, and now the idea seems to be gaining traction all over again. So what are the pros and cons of universal basic income? To discuss this threadbare, I have with me two eminent economists, Rathin Roy, director of the New Delhi-based Fiscal think tank, NIPFP, and TT Ram Mohan, professor of economics at IIM Ahmedabad. Welcome to the show, Rathin, TTR. Rathin, the economic survey, which I am going to take as our starting point, says UBI has three components: universality, unconditionality and agency. That means it provides support in the form of cash transfers, leaving it to the recipients to do whatever they wish with the money. So let's try and look at each of these in turn. Let me start with universality. Is there really a case for universality, that is giving every citizen a basic income? We'll come to other issues later in the discussion, but for now let's focus only on universality. What is the justification for, say, for giving a Mukesh Ambani or a Narayana Murthy cash support on par with that paid to the roadside chai wala and with taxpayer money? Can the mere fact that we are unable to identify the needy really be a reason, Rathin?
Mythili, the most productive way in my view is to look at this is as follows. Imagine that every citizen of India has a PAN number. Some citizens of India pay tax and some citizens of India receive money based on their filing of a tax return. So what effectively then happens is that Mr. Ambani, who does pay tax, gets an exemption equivalent to the amount of basic income, exactly that sort of exemption. And Mr. let's say X, who does not pay tax and gets the universal basic income based on his filing of his or her filing of a tax return, receives money from the state. So I do not think that the fact that everybody gets the same income is either the right way to look at it or necessarily therefore an impediment. If you think of it in terms of everyone has a PAN number, some people pay tax and get an exemption threshold, and some people receive money from the state, I think that gets that out of the way.
Okay, TTR, would you agree with that view? Because tax payment after all is a function of your ability, whereas a basic income would be given to everybody across, regardless of whether they have the ability or they need it or not. In fact, come to think of it, let alone identifying the needy, how does one even identify citizens in this country? The Aadhaar card establishes only residency, and which is why all the illegal Bangladeshi migrants, yes, I am saying that, possess Aadhaar cards, but the UBI is meant only for Indian citizens. So how does one go about even identifying our Indian citizens, TTR?
Yeah, I mean, there are these implementation issues, but to address the question of universality, I think even the people who are advocating it are only talking about, near universality. That is, you will reach the basic income to say about 70 to 75% of the population, similar to what is contemplated under the Food Security Act. So I think there is a general presumption that people who are relatively well off, and certainly the wealthy, will be excluded in some way. Either they will exclude themselves voluntarily, as many have in the case of the LPG subsidy, or we will find ways to exclude them, and the economic survey mentions some obvious ways. I mean, if you are owning a fridge or an air conditioner or something, you will be excluded. So I don't think we should take the concept very literally and think that we are going to be putting money in the hands of 100% of the population. I think something more realistic, which would be something like 70% of the population.
That is true, TTR, but how does one decide which 30% are you going to give it to? And that exactly is the problem in India, because in fact the entire problem with our subsidies is that because we have not even been able to weed out those who don't deserve. But rather, let me move on to the next feature, that is unconditionality. That is, the money will be given without any conditions whatsoever attached. This is quite unlike the conditional cash transfers that use a carrot and stick technique to say get people to send their children to school, give them vaccinations, etc. In fact, the survey's universal basic income model does none of these things. It just gives cash to the beneficiaries, and here in fact I'd like to combine it with another feature, the third feature, agency, which means that the beneficiary is free to do whatever he or she wishes with it. Make a bonfire maybe, but perhaps I'm being too cynical. Rathin, what are your views on these two other features?
A universal basic income has to be universal and unconditional. If you take my model of an income tax credit, then no one sort of judges whether Mr. Ambani should get income tax exemption on the first lakh of his income, and no one is judging whether Mr. X should get exemption on the first 1 lakh of their income based on whether they drink it up or they use it on more virtuous pursuits like the consumption of vegetarian food or yoga, right? Okay. So in the same way, this is a policy that is intended to be progressive in that the lower your total income, the more important universal basic income will be to you to attain a set of consumption opportunities that you otherwise would not be able to attain. So bringing in sort of Victorian arguments regarding conditionality and all that in this sort of policy, I think is misplaced. Again, I refer you back to the income tax example. No one asks whether Mr. Ambani should get a deduction on the first 2 or 3 lakhs of his income, even if he earns 40 crores. We don't ask that question. Why are we asking it now? Likewise, no one asks whether Mr. X who is below the threshold, whether they're using their money on drink or on yoga. So why should we ask that now?
Rathin, but isn't there a difference? Because in the case of income tax, one is taxing on a progressive basis. So you are assuming that Mr. Ambani can pay more and the chaiwala can pay less, and that progressivity is built into the tax structure. Whereas in the universal basic income, you're assuming that they're on par, which is just not true.
There is no progressivity in the basic exemption on income tax. What happens in terms of taxation happens later, so that progressivity is maintained. All that happens is everyone gets the same exemption irrespective of the total income, right?
That is true, but there is a progressivity built beyond the basic exemption. There is a progressivity in it, certainly, isn't it?
There is no progressivity whatsoever. Mr. Ambani has exactly the same income tax threshold where he doesn't pay income tax as I do,
Rathin,
or somebody just above the threshold.
I'm not talking about the threshold at all. I'm talking about the rate.
I'm saying that is how you need to look at basic income.
Okay.
If you have no objection to everyone having the same income tax threshold, irrespective of how much they earn or how much they consume, then I do not see why you should apply that judgment to a universal basic income, which is effectively a negative income tax in that sense.
Okay, that's a very different way of looking at it from what I would have looked at it. But TTR, would you agree? Because in fact, it's true that research shows that people are not quite as irresponsible as some of us fear. And if I may add, women tend to be more responsible if the money is given to them rather than to men. So would that make these two features of unconditionality and agency acceptable? And would you agree with Rathin that a universal basic income is no different from the minimum exemption that is given for income tax, and that is the same regardless of who you are? Would you agree with that logic, and that can that be applied to UBI?
Yes, I would go along with that logic, and I think it's integral to universal basic income that it is unconditional. I mean, the whole idea, I mean, if you look at it conceptually, you're saying that each individual has his or own utility curve, and therefore, it's better to give people money than to give them particular goods or services. So you're saying that you give them X amount of money and leave it to them to maximize their utility the way they want by distributing that money across a set of goods and services. But if you're giving them rice or wheat or midday meal or whatever, you're telling them that this is what you should be consuming. And so universal basic income has the feature of unconditionality built into it. It's not something which can be separated from the concept at all.
No, that is true.
And yes, and the issues which go with the unconditionality, I mean, the problems are you've responded to some of these, that people will be lazy and that they will not work hard enough, or they will spend on temptation goods and so on. And the economic survey has cited an impressive range of studies which suggests that people are not all that irresponsible, and they're reasonably rational in their behavior.
That is true. The survey does quote some studies, but what the survey doesn't quote is that there are as many studies, TTR, saying exactly the opposite, saying that welfare losses when you give people cash rather than giving them food or school uniforms or textbooks, the welfare loss in giving cash is much higher, because particularly in our kind of Indian society, where the men really dictate how the money is to be spent, the evidence is not really so clear that cash is really the god that the UBI survey seems to be suggesting. What would you say, TTR, to that?
Yeah, I mean, this certainly has to be backed up with the studies in the Indian context. They do mention some studies in the Indian context which point to that. But the point is that you should not view universal basic income as a substitute for a whole range of social security schemes. I don't think it would be entirely correct, for instance, to say that because you are giving universal basic income, you shouldn't have the midday meal scheme, or you shouldn't have basic healthcare facilities. So it all depends on how you interpret this scheme. It would be very dangerous and unwise to view universal basic income as a substitute for an entire range of social security schemes. Some obvious candidates have to be weeded out. I mean, if you go along with this idea, you won't have public distribution scheme, you won't have MNREGA and so on. But that doesn't mean that many other social security schemes also get eliminated. So we really have to walk on two legs. Even with universal basic income, you will give them the income, and there will also be irreducible minimum of social security services which you will have to provide.
Okay, so the way TTR sees the universal basic income will not replace all subsidies, but it will supplement some basic minimum subsidies which the government will continue, but that raises the entire issue of cost, and I think we will come to that after the break. Please do bear with us. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing this entirely new concept that the government and a lot of economists are now talking about, universal basic income. And to my surprise, Rathin, before the break, I thought you would be a firm opponent of it, but you seem to be a vociferous supporter. So let me now turn to one aspect on which I think maybe you will agree with me, that for the country like India, the biggest objection really is the cost. The survey, in fact, after advocating universality, says that universal coverage might not be possible and estimates that even at 75% coverage, the cost will be about 4.9% of GDP, which is a substantial amount. It also says that if you do away with all the subsidies and especially the non-merit subsidies, tax concessions, etc., there is enough fiscal space, saying that the argument that there is not enough fiscal space is not valid. So let me pose two questions to you at this juncture. Is it possible, given our kind of political economy, to do away with subsidies? And two, even if we do have the fiscal space, is this the best use of taxpayer money, or should the government be using that money to build, primary schools, primary healthcare, roads, bridges in rural areas where the private sector just will not go? Rathin?
Well, I actually have a problem with universal basic income, and I'm going to answer your question in my context. Why are we trying to give universal basic income? As Mohan correctly said, the intention is not to replace other subsidies, in which case it is a terrible thing to do. Because you must remember that other let us assume that we want to give basic income because you want to reduce poverty in the country. Now, poverty reduction happens principally when people earn more and therefore they are not poor. So if you are giving basic income to reduce poverty in the country or to reduce inequality, then you are doing what, as economists we know, essentially is implementing the second theorem of welfare economics, which is you are saying, okay, the country is growing at 8%. I am not happy with the income distribution as a consequence of this growth of 8%. And therefore, what I am going to do is I am going to take some money from some people who are earning more than 8% and give it to people who are earning less than 8%. That is, there is no question of cost there. That is a pure redistributive measure. It does nothing to GDP, changes preferences, but it is not a cost in a fiscal sense. It is taking from X and giving to Y. It is a pure redistributive transfer. The only implication of that is that rich people may consume and save less, and poor people will consume and save more. If you want to do that, go right ahead with it. If you take the negative income tax model, you will see what I mean. Other than a marginal increase in the cost of tax administration, dealing with this is not in principle a problem. And herein lies my worry about basic income. If India is to grow at a nominal growth rate of, let's say, 12%, with let's say 4% inflation for the next 30 years, then do the back of the envelope calculation. If every Indian's income grows by at least 8%, that is 2/3 of the aggregate GDP, every Indian, you will eliminate poverty in a time frame of 25 to 30 years. You will still have a worsening of the income distribution, because it means some people are going to earn 2/3 of GDP and some people are therefore going to earn more than the average GDP growth rate. So when you say that universal basic income is desirable for redistribution or poverty alleviation, not replacing subsidies, I am not there, then effectively you are saying one of two things. The first thing, either you are saying India will not grow at 8% real and 4% nominal. I don't want to go there, because I sincerely hope not, and because then much of this conversation is not relevant. Or you are saying India will grow at that level, but there are going to be a number of people, significant amounts of people, who are not even going to earn 2/3 of that growth in terms of their income and consumption or consumption. That's a terrible thing to say. That means implicitly that we have implicitly given up the idea of inclusive growth, which I interpret to mean everyone participates in the growing business. And what we are then doing is we are going to have exclusive growth and we are going to have universal basic income to make up for that failure in our growth process to be inclusive. That is what worries me hugely about universal basic income, and that is the elephant in the room. No one from the economic survey to Mr. Bardhan to Mr. Joshi, who are proponents of the universal basic income, seem to want to look at, and I'm going to keep highlighting it.
But Rathin, between the choice of giving a man a fish a day and teaching him how to fish, surely the latter is a better alternative. So the state should play the role of facilitator, and if you have growth, then growth will filter down, and that's what we've seen. In fact, there was a maximum reduction in poverty during the years when the economy grew well. So this kind of dividing and subdividing the pie, is that the answer, number one? And number two, you did not answer my question of can we eliminate even some of these subsidies, given the fact that it's notoriously difficult once vested interests develop to do away with subsidies. So can you think in our kind of political economy of the government being able to do it? Of course, they've done it in the case of some petroleum items, but by and large, it's going to be a Herculean task in a democracy.
I repeat, if 2/3 of India is able to grow at their incomes and consumption at 2/3 of the growth rate, then you will eliminate poverty, you will have inclusive growth. So this teaching a man to fish business, Mythili, implicitly what you're saying when you're bringing in a UBI is you are not able to teach a person to fish so that they can participate in the economy. It's a horrifying admission, an absolutely horrifying admission, that every Indian will not even earn 2/3 of the growth rate over the next 30 years. Or we are not going to grow, I'm not even going there. On the question of subsidies, I think it is moot. As I said, this is a different, and I agree with Ramon here. You see, the food subsidy is not given to reduce poverty. You have to be clear why we are doing universal basic income. If you're saying that it is there to substitute for other kinds of subsidies, it's a terrible idea, because subsidies have different objectives, whether you want to reduce them or not. Whether you want to reduce export promotion, whether you want to reduce tax exemptions, whether you want to reduce the food subsidy, they have very, very different objectives, or subsidies to education. The objectives are not the only two conceivable objectives that they ought to be with a UBI, which are either poverty reduction or a better income distribution that you would get without government intervention. Neither of those objectives would not be met if growth were inclusive. We are therefore, when we bring in a UBI, assuming that those are the objectives we want to address, we are admitting that growth will not be inclusive over the next 30 years, and that really troubles me. We need to then go back and look at how we are growing and what we are growing, rather than try and put band-aids by imposing universal basic incomes to ex post correct the income distribution.
TTR, I think Rathin and I differ quite fundamentally on whether UBI is the way to go about eliminating poverty. But in fact, a country like Switzerland also till fairly recently, they held a referendum about a UBI, and that's a country which is much, much richer than India, and they felt the cost is too high. So I wanted your response to Rathin's argument that the cost is really not all that much. And in fact, the survey also admits that there are difficulties in estimating what is the amount to be given by UBI, but then it subsequently glosses over this. In fact, the final number that they give is well below the poverty line estimate, and it also admits that politics can play a huge role in determining what is the exact amount, and each time it's up for revision and so on, and so it calls for a sufficiently politically neutral mechanism. Does that suggest some kind of a naivete that sits very oddly with our normally very matter-of-fact finance ministry technocrats, because we've not been able to have even a rail regulator? So what are the chances that we'll have an independent, neutral body deciding what is this universal basic income to be, how much is the quantity? Or each time before the elections, will you see the ruling party propose a very high income, saying after me the deluge? TTR?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the implementation issues, the nitty-gritty of universal basic income, I mean, they pose such significant challenges that I don't see this happening at all in the foreseeable future. I think in fairness to the economic survey, even they are not saying this is an idea whose time has come. They are only saying this is an idea whose time is ripe for discussion. So there you have it, this is now something which they have sort of thrown up for debate. And I think, as in the case of GST or any other reform, this is something which will unfold over a decade or so. I can't see this happening very quickly. First, of course, there is a fiscal cost that is involved, and they estimate the cost, as you pointed out, at 4.9% of GDP. When you're thinking of a universal basic income of only rupees 7,620, and of course, there are people who want to be more generous, and that will push up the fiscal cost to something like 10% of GDP. And how you are going to find the fiscal space for this? is something that people have to sort of wrestle with. But I think one or two things are very clear. You certainly have to do with what they call middle class subsidies, which themselves are not easy to sort of address. It's not easy to do even the so-called middle class subsidies. But you also have to do with the entire range of schemes that you have now, central and state government schemes, about 950 of them, including PDS, midday meal scheme, MNREGA and all that. Most of these things will have to be dismantled. And I think this is not something which is going to be easy to accomplish at all. One of the things I think which is worth bearing in mind, when you talk about, coming up with something new, is that, many of the inefficiencies and leakages that people are talking about in the present schemes pertain to fairly old data. Now, if you look at PDS, I think there have been significant improvements in PDS in recent years, most notably in some states such as Chhattisgarh and Tamil Nadu. Similarly, I think the economic survey itself mentions that MNREGA has become far more efficient. So, if you are saying that you are going to use JAM, and better technology, the combination of bank accounts and Aadhaar and mobile to make a success of universal basic income, why not use the same technology to more efficiently implement the existing schemes? I think that is an argument which will not go away. Taking into account the fiscal cost involved in having a truly universal basic income. So, you see not just the cost, but also the other preconditions which are required to make it truly universal. For instance, the minimum thing that you need is a universal bank account, and even today 1/3 of people don't have bank accounts. So, what we are talking about is something which can happen only in the distant future, and perhaps, as the economic survey itself indicates, a good way to begin would be to do it very gradually, and something which is more feasible would be trying to sort of universalize social security benefits or maternity benefits for select people, social security benefits for elderly and disabled. Why don't we universalize that to start with? It's a modest start, make a success of it, and then try to think of bigger things in life such as universal basic income. You see, it should not happen, that you reach out for some pie in the sky, and in the process you completely undermine things which are, delivering reasonably well on the ground, and the dismantling of which can have very serious consequences for people who are dependent on them.
Okay. In fact, I've been proved completely wrong, because I thought TTR, the academic, would argue in favor of UBI, and Rathin, the fiscal economist, would argue against. But clearly, you can never predict what people will say. And in fact, Rathin, I wanted to ask you what the point that TTR raised. He said, why not repair? Because as we've seen in the PDS, it is possible to deliver much better PDS. So why not repair what we have at the moment, that rather than reach for that pie in the sky? In fact, the survey lists 3 principal and related objections to the universal basic income. It says that whether UBI is likely to reduce the incentive to work. Secondly, whether income should be detached from employment, that means regardless of how much I earning, should I get the UBI? And the third is a concern regarding reciprocity. If society is indeed a scheme of what it calls social cooperation, should this income be unconditional with no regard to people's contribution to society? Remember, we are talking about a country where people don't pay their taxes. That means where they should pay, also they don't pay. So how does one get over all these, Rathin?
Well, look, again, I don't know why you're going on about cost. Imagine a situation where the government of India takes 10 rupees from me and gives it to a poor person. There is no cost to government. You can have every other scheme you want, and on top of that, if I have what is called a pure redistributive tax and transfer, right? It's well known in economics. You could do it. Now, feasibility apart, I'm saying first you have to be very clear why UBI is there. Forget Queen Victoria for just 1 second, okay? Morality, whether people will drink, whether people don't pay their taxes. Just let's ask the basic question, why do you want universal basic income? If you want it to generate employment or to do PDS better, I have no comment to make. I think I completely agree that that is the wrong instrument. There's only one reason you may want to have a universal basic income, and that is because you're not satisfied with the income distribution as the economy grows. And if you're not satisfied with the income distribution as the economy grows, then this is the only redistributive measure that will help you do it, in which case cost is not relevant. What the government is doing is redistributing money. It is taking from X and giving to Y. So let's get that out of the way. Now, if I'm saying that if this is your purpose, then everything that you have been saying so far about inclusive growth is not going to hold true in the future. That would require a fundamental rethinking of our economic strategy. Whether PDS is efficient or NREGA is efficient is not the real reason behind universal basic income. So, if it's going to be a substitute for existing schemes, then it's going to be inefficient. If it is going to be a realistic attempt to impact the income redistribution because we are failing to do that, because our growth is unequalizing, then it is a very worrying admission, and I'd like that debated.
Okay, Rathin, but when you're talking about redistribution, when the government takes tax money from me and uses it to build primary healthcare, primary education in the villages, that already is redistribution from the rich to the poor. But I'm afraid we've run out of time completely. So I'll have to end this discussion now. Maybe we'll come back to it later, Rathin, when UBI gains still more traction, because to my mind, frankly, it sounds a bit like communism. It's based on a similar, noble, but completely misguided, impractical ideas. And my worry really is that as the next general election approaches, the government may be tempted to go down this path despite the finance minister's reported opposition. In fact, that would be most unfortunate, because just when we moved away from the kind of MyBab regime of the pre-reform days and its concomitant 3% Hindu rate of growth to a market-driven system with its promise of close to double-digit growth, where the state is only an enabler, I worry a little whether we should turn the clock back. Though, as you say, Rathin, there may be something to be said for your point of view. But thank you so much, Rathin and TTR, for joining me in this discussion. And it's always good to have people, experts who disagree rather than agree with each other. Thank you also for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. In the meanwhile, if there's any other issue that you'd like to find discussed in this program, please do write in to us at the email ID you see at the bottom of your screen.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/etnow.